All right, let's take our Bibles and turn to Acts chapter 21. Acts chapter 21, where we'll be looking at verses 27 through 40. Acts chapter 21, verses 27 through 40. And in this paragraph, actually two paragraphs, we see Paul in the temple. And to bring us into the context, Paul was nearing the end of his third journey, what we would call his third missionary journey. He'd come all the way along, from Macedonia and Asia. Men of the churches there had been assigned or selected by their church to bring that church's offering to the saints in Jerusalem. And so Paul, with quite a delegation, one or two men from many churches across the province, the Roman province of Asia and Macedonia and Achaia, came with Paul to Jerusalem to present this gift. And along the way, all along the way, believers, the Bible says, the Holy Spirit showed that Paul he didn't know exactly what, and as he got closer, more light was given to him. But all along the way, the Holy Spirit was telling him that bonds and imprisonment await Paul in Jerusalem. And Paul is quite certain that the Lord is leading him to Jerusalem, and at the same time, so we would say he's brave, we might say. He's courageous in the face of knowing that he ought to go there, and also knowing that when he gets there, bonds and imprisonment await him. He had been in bonds and in prison a few times already, but it seems clear that a longer and more severe imprisonment awaited him. As he gets to Jerusalem, we talked last week about how the church leaders of the leaders of the church in Jerusalem requested that Paul join some men in their church that had taken on them a Nazirite vow. And so consistent, and I want to emphasize that, consistent with Paul's previous practice. It seems clear that he had taken on himself a Nazirite vow toward the end of his second journey. And throughout his ministry, he tried to do whatever he could to reach whatever group of people he was near. He was not a wild firebrand, we might say. He was bold in the proclamation of the truth, but he wasn't rash. And so, consistent with his previous practice and teaching, Paul joins these four men in the culmination, the end of their Nazirite vow. And that was a 7-day period of purification. At the end of it, he had been out of Jerusalem. He had been in foreign lands, so he needed to go through this purification process according to Jewish laws and traditions, and he joined with them. And in this passage, we're going to see, and I'm going to say this now because I don't know exactly how the timing will go. We may get done early, believe it or not, and I'll be up here just saying words that make no sense till the time that the bell would ring. But that doesn't normally happen. So I'm going to say my points that I have for the end right now. The main thing I want us to see, or the theme I want us to see through this passage that I think is important for us to get out of this, again, very narrative, just a lot of different things happening, is that God is sovereign, and it's wonderful, it's amazing to see how God uses the believing Jews and the unbelieving Jews and the Romans, all of these different groups of people, not coordinating amongst themselves, but their suggestions, their actions are all worked together to accomplish God's plan in Paul's life. God had told Paul that he would stand before rulers and kings, and he stood before Sergius Paulus and certain places. But as we know the book of Acts, here we go into 7, 8 chapters of before one ruler, one king after another, and on his way to the ruler, the emperor of the entire world. That hadn't happened in Paul's life. And God had said that he would stand before those, and that he would that he would suffer for his name. Now, he'd suffered a lot, but here again, now we go into 7, 8 chapters of more suffering, longer imprisonments, and what we should remember first, I think, from all of this, from this passage, is that God is in control, and God can use whatever and whomever, or whoever, whatever's the right way to say that, he wants. He can use unbelieving, fanatic Jews. In our story of Baptist history this morning, he used the persecution of the Catholic Church, of the state church, to draw out of a man a wonderful confession of faith and a tremendous challenge to us yet today. So the believing Jews bring this suggestion to Paul, getting Paul into the temple. Paul thinks it's a good idea and agrees with it. The unbelieving Jews, they see Paul in the temple and they make up all kinds of things and start a riot. The indifferent, we might say, Romans, pagan Romans that just want to make sure there's no riot taking place, they come down and quell the riot and all of this is all these different people working, doing what they believe is right, and it's all different, are really accomplishing God's will in Paul's life. And so, verse 27, we see, this is the next paragraph. If we would read the sentence before, the verse before, then Paul took the men, these are the 4 that had taken on them the Nazirite vow, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. So he goes in there and says, I'm signifying the days of purification, and at the end of these days of purification, I'll be the one that brings their offering for them. I'm at charges to them. I'm supplying this offering, and I'm joining with them in this Nazirite vow, and that's where they shave their head, and they burn the hair, and they boil the meat, and all this. And there was, at this point, we have a fully functioning temple. And there are certain places where that was done. The Temple Mount is about the only thing that remains of the temple that was in existence here. If you've seen pictures of Jerusalem, you see the most common one would be the picture, the view from the Mount of Olives. There's a valley between you, and then there's this high walls and a flat platform, and on that is the Dome of the Rock. Well, that flat platform is where the temple stood at that time. No Dome of the Rock at that time. They hadn't even thought of that for 700 years at that point. But there's a flat platform, and on that flat platform, anyone could go. Anybody could go on that flat platform. And then there was a temple, and there was different walls and gates around the temple. We remembered hopefully you would remember, or if you haven't been taught it, the tabernacle, the most primitive place of worship for God's people, had a Holy of Holies, and then in front of that, a holy place. And then around that, a courtyard where the sacrifices took place. And that was a courtyard that was protected by a fence of linen curtains. And no one could go into that area except they were bringing an offering of some sort. Well, when they made the temple, they had those buildings and this type of thing, but it was much more elaborate and more courtyards, we might say. There was a courtyard for women. But the women had to be Israelite women. There was a courtyard for all the Israelites. Anybody who was an Israelite could go inside this area, and that's the area where they would boil the meat of the Nazirite vow and other things and burn their hair in the fire of that. But then outside that was another courtyard where anybody could go. And as it was, the Jews were very zealous for their rituals and for their temple. And so they had these big signs. They've been discovered by archaeologists 150 years ago or so. Big signs that says, any alien who proceeds past these gates has no one to blame but themselves for their death, which is imminent, or something very, it's very, very obvious what they and the Romans conceded the point to them that no trial was necessary to beat to death the person who had, the alien, the Gentile who had gone inside there. He would be discovered, he would be dragged out and beaten to death right there. No laws or anything, it was a done deal. Which is very telling, because the Romans were known for their system of justice. And so that they would allow that shows how fervently the Jews believed about this. Is that me making all that noise? Oh, okay. I thought my electronics were making noises. Sorry. Sorry if you were making those noises. Barry. I don't know if it's him. He just had a big grin on his face. Anyway, so the 7 days of this accomplishment were almost ended. Verse 27, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw him in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him. So Jews that were from Asia saw Paul in the temple. Why were Jews from Asia there? It was the Feast of Pentecost. It was a time when everybody, there was 3 times a year where there was tremendous feast, and Jews that had been scattered around the world came and celebrated. And this was one, if you remember, there were thousands and thousands of Jews there on what we would call the day of Pentecost, when Peter preached and 3,000 were saved. This is another day of Pentecost, as if we might say. That's not the one that Peter preached on. It's the one that Paul was mobbed on. And so, or it's near that time, I guess I should say. So they were there. They recognized him on sight. You know, have you ever been thousands of miles away from home and somebody says, "Hey, I know you"? Well, Paul was that kind of person, especially with Jews that didn't believe from cities that he had done tremendous works in. What had he done in Ephesus? He'd been there for 3 years. He had a tremendous work, a work so great that the whole province of Asia had been affected by his work there. There had been a tremendous uprising. Now, this is mostly the pagans, but there were Jews involved in it too, if you recall from the story, where they were in the theater chanting, "Great is Diana" of the Ephesians for hours. So Paul was not unknown in Asia, and Ephesus was the capital of Asia, and these Jews from Asia saw him right away. And they knew him on sight, and they stirred up all the people, and they laid hands on him, and they cried out, "Men of Israel, help! This is the man!" So first of all, we might say, why do they need help for? If we recall other things we've read about Paul, he's a small man, and physically not a powerful man. He's got infirmities, and the Corinthians, remember, say his physical presence is weak. You know, his words are great, but his physical. But what do they want help for? They want a mob to jump on this and to be there as part of it. And they say, "This is the man that teaches all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place." So against the people and against the law and against this place. And it's interesting to note that by this time, in the Jews' history, Pentecost had grown into be a celebration of the law in the temple also, beside what it was originally designed to celebrate. And so anybody that was there at Pentecost was already celebrating the law and the temple and and of course the temple, because pretty much everything that they had to do in the law was associated with the temple. And so here's a man who has been speaking, teaching everywhere against the people and against the law in this place. And besides that, and further, brought Greeks also into the temple. Now, clearly they don't mean that he brought Greeks into the area where Greeks could go, right? They're saying he brought Greeks into the holy place, into this holy place, into the temple, and has polluted, that's what they said, and has polluted this holy place, right there where they were. Now, what's supposed to happen to somebody who does that? You grab them, you drag them out, and you beat them to death right outside the temple. And that's what they wanted to happen. Now, of course, these are false charges. We talked about how the believing Jews had been indoctrinated by Judaizers, people saying things that were not true about Paul. And these unbelieving Jews present these false charges. They made inferences from Paul's teaching. Paul taught certain things, and they inferred things that were not true. Let me just say, we've seen this in our own lives here and there or wherever, but just a reminder, it's really easy to know everything that an opponent or an enemy or somebody who believes differently than us even thinks or believes. You've said it yourself. Yeah, he did this because. How do you know that? How do I know that? We don't know those things. Okay, I'm not saying that you're the mob that would have attacked Paul, but this is just human nature, isn't it? Isn't it really, really easy just to know? We disagree with someone, and so we know everything that they think. And of course, it's all evil. It couldn't be that we are mistaken about what they think or believe. These brought up partly lies, partly wrong conclusions because they misunderstood what Paul was teaching, partly exaggerations of what Paul taught, partly hasty assumptions that he must think this because of something else. But it's interesting, almost everyone who writes about this notices that these things that Paul was accused of here in the mob are exactly the same things that Stephen was accused of when he was mobbed. And it's interesting that Paul looked on and was part of the mob, we might say, that apprehended Stephen. But so Luke attempts, and I say this understanding that this is the scripture, but it seems Luke puts a parenthesis in there in verse 29 that Luke gives an explanation. It says, "For they had seen before with him in the city Trophimus, an Ephesian, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple." Now, if that's true, we know that they're still exaggerating. What did they say that Paul had done? He's brought, what's it say? Greeks, right? It's just like he's running a tourist, operation, just bringing all these Greeks in here, polluting this holy place. They had seen one Ephesian with him in parts of the city before, and of course Trophimus was a delegate from the church at Ephesus with the offering, and so he'd been traveling with Paul, working with Paul. He would have been very comfortable around Paul, and of course if you're comfortable around Paul in the city, Paul would of course have brought you into the holy place, where right past those signs that says any alien who ventures past this is in, but it's just really foolish. Kind of the charges, and most charges like these are foolish when we have the time and opportunity to just consider them. So, but they had supposed that Paul had brought Trophimus, an Ephesian, into the temple. And I kind of already mentioned this. There is a middle wall of partition. It's called that. You might recognize that term, that Paul uses that term at a later time in kind of a symbolic sense, that God had broke down the middle wall of partition between Greeks and Jews. But here, there was a wall there about 2.5 to 4.5. Okay, so the different ways that they might designate something, so we don't know exactly, but probably 4.5 feet tall, with these big signs on it, with wording on it saying, "Stay out," basically. Prominent signs on them. And so they grabbed Paul, they said, "Come here and help," and because this guy has done all this, and verse 30 says, "And all the city was moved, and the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple, and forthwith the doors were shut." So all the city was moved. Clearly, not everyone in the whole city came in there. Okay, but word of what happened spread out. There's agitation. Did you hear what happened down at, blah, blah, blah. And quick, fast, like wildfire. And I'm sure some of them were like, they had heard of Paul, and they were there, they wanted to get a piece of him too. Especially since he had brought some Gentile into the holy place and defiled it. And so the people ran together, and they took Paul and drew him out of the temple. Now this out of the temple would not mean off the Temple Mount. It would be out of the holy place. I don't have a diagram of it, but I've tried to describe. We have, the holy place and the Holy of Holies, and then these courtyards where other things took place, where the court of Israel would be called, and the court of women, where only Israelites would be, and they took them out of that into the court of the Gentiles. Out of this holy place that they had mentioned, out of the temple, there were doors there. And they closed those doors. Forthwith, the doors were shut. Here we have this inflamed mob. I've already kind of said some of these points, but they're more excitable at feast times when devoted Jews from across the world were there. We know this. We know that the Romans had more soldiers in Jerusalem at the feast as a standard practice because it was more likely that they would get rioting, and there was uneasiness and stuff that could happen. So they had more there. There was more soldiers there at feast times, and the Jews were clearly more excitable at feast times. And when these men grabbed Paul and said, "Help us," and all this, there was an immediate explosion. The city was moved. Everybody ran together. They didn't see any need to have the charges proven against Paul. There was no need to have the execute justice first, try the case later. That's not the first time that happened either. There was careful scruples, though. They were very, very careful to protect the temple from defilement. Okay, here was this guy. He had defiled the temple, not at the moment, because there was no Greek there at this time. They just saw him and said he had done it, and they dragged him out. This guy is defiling the temple. We have to drag him out so we can kill him. Murder outside the temple is fine. Having some blood fall off of some person inside is unbearable. We can't have that. Also, by closing the doors, this prevented the criminal from flying to the altar for refuge. You remember there's different times in history. If somebody, they would go and they'd grab a hold of the horns of the altar as a refuge, because there would be opportunity then to hear his case or something along those lines. By closing the doors, nobody was getting into that altar to be rescued or have any execution delayed. It was probably hoped that Paul would be killed in the mob with no one person responsible. Okay? Get enough people in there, and that's why they would have said, "Help us! Here's the guy." Get everything going, start beating on him. Hopefully he dies, and no one person killed him. It was just a mob action. So then verse 31 says, and as they went about to kill him, tidings came unto the chief captain of the band that all Jerusalem was in an uproar. Now this captain, the chief captain of the band, this is the word kiliarch or something like that. It's the word 1,000. He's the captain of 1,000 soldiers. It says, word comes to him. He is stationed in Antonia. It's called a castle. It's called the fortress of Antonia. It was built by Herod the Great, and it was immediately adjacent, in fact, connected to the temple. There's a little bit of humor here. This place where Roman soldiers would be stationed was built higher than the temple. That's kind of a little bit of an insult. The temple should be the highest thing and all this, but it's built adjacent to the temple where they could look down on the temple proceedings, anything that was happening in there. And I'm sure some soldiers were observing what happened and saw it very quickly. The narrative gives us that idea. And in the fortress Antonia was where the high priestly garments were stored, and he could go there and get those to be used at one time a year. But they were under the lock and key, we might say, of the Roman government. So it was built alongside the temple, and there were stairs, 2 sets of stairs actually, from this fortress that went down into the Temple Mount area, this flat platform area. So this, in verse 32 says, he immediately took soldiers and centurions. So centurions were captains of 100, and ran down unto this mob. And when the mob, saw the chief captain and soldiers, they left beating Paul. All of a sudden, there's nothing going on here, right? So the Roman soldiers representing Roman justice arrive, and all of a sudden they stop beating Paul. Because they understood there would be they would suffer severe punishments for inciting a riot. So then the chief captain, verse 33, came near and took him, Paul, and commanded Paul to be bound with 2 chains, and demanded who he was and what he had done. Here's an unlikely deliverer. This is the Roman captain of 1,000 who rescues Paul. They bound him with chains. This fulfilled Agabus's prophecy. And he takes Paul into his custody, and it's like, take him and then ask questions. Well, in this case, he's rescued. He's saved his life. And then he said, okay, so now what's going on? Rather than saying, well, why are you guys beating this guy while they're still beating him? Who is he and what has he done? In verse 34, and some cried one thing, some another. Among the multitude, nobody knew. And so even he could not know the certainty for the tumult. He commanded him to be carried into the castle. It's just obvious that he says, I'm going to take him aside and I'll just ask him myself. I'll chastise him and get some answers from him and find out what's going on. Most did not even know why they were beating him. They just knew that he needed to be beaten. There were many different answers, and as he takes him, as he can't find out whatever, as he takes him, another tumult erupts, almost as if they think we had him and now we lost him, and they rushed them. And when he came to this, verse 35, when he came upon the stairs, so it was that he was born of the soldiers, for the people were still trying to get him, and the soldiers kind of had to, I just imagine they had to lift him up on their shoulders and just take him up the stairs and beat away with their shields and whatever the people that were trying to get at him. For the multitude of the people, verse 36, followed after, crying, away with him. Now, this is a common phrase. This means kill him. Crucify him. That's what it means. Away with him. Crucify and execute him. The soldiers take him toward the castle, up this stairway, and verse 37 says, and as Paul was led into the castle, he said to the chief captain, may I speak unto thee? Who said, canst thou speak Greek? Art not thou that Egyptian, which before these days made us an uproar, and led us out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? So Paul, through this, he is getting beaten, but it seems like he's calm. He has the peace of God ruling in his heart. And he's being jostled along, and finally he says, can I talk to you? And he does it with respect and in Greek, in the native language of the captain. And so the captain says, are you that Egyptian? An Egyptian would have spoken Greek. And he says all these things. Paul speaks to him. The captain believes that he's an Egyptian ringleader. This guy, 4 years before, had gotten a bunch of people to follow him, and he'd convinced them that they should camp out on the Mount of Olives, and he was going to speak words that would cause the walls of Jerusalem to fall down. And then they would go in and take over Rome and capture Jerusalem for themselves. Of course, many people followed him, 4,000. But Felix, who was the governor, attacked them, killed 400 of them, captured another 200 or something like that. But he escaped back to Egypt. So this guy thought he's come back, and out into the wilderness with 4,000 men that were murderers. The word murderers is the word Sicarii, and these were vigilantes. They carried daggers under their robes, and especially at feast times when there was a lot of people around, anybody that they felt needed to be dispensed with, it's crowded, they'd kill them and they're gone. They were murderers. So Rome, we see, is the protector of the infant Christianity, we might say. Rome sheltered Christianity, and Jerusalem persecuted Christianity. And so then Paul says, verse 39, I'm a man which am a Jew of Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I beseech thee, suffer me to speak unto the people. So Paul denies he's not that Egyptian. He says, I'm a Jew, and I'm a Jew of Tarsus. Tarsus at one point had more learning than any of the rest of the world beside Alexandria and Athens. It was not a mean city. It was not a lowly city. Cilicia is the province that Tarsus was the capital of. And so Paul, in a calm and respectful way, asks for permission to speak to the people, and the captain gives him permission. He says, and when he'd given him license, Paul stood on the stairs and beckoned with his hand to the people. And then we start the next paragraph before the end of the chapter. But the captain grants him permission. Paul gets the people's attention, and there's a great silence, it says, and then he begins to speak to them in their language. And you're going to have to come back next week, 2 weeks from now, actually, to hear Paul's address to the crowd there. And we get into a series of several of Paul's testimonies that he gives over and over again through the end of Acts. We should remember, God is always in control, and God can use whoever he wants to. Even those that are shaking their fist at God and hate God are accomplishing his will and his purposes, even past, in spite of themselves.